Okay. Thank you all, and to those of you joining online, thanks for your patience as we get the room organized and started. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you today to this special event co-hosted by the UT Asia Policy Program and the Korea Economic Institute. This is the second time that we've held this conference workshop here at UT Austin, and we were delighted with the conference volume that came out last year as a result of this collaboration, and really are pleased to have the opportunity to welcome KEI and a distinguished group of panelists again this year to talk about some really important and challenging areas of collaboration. My name is Sheena Chestnut-Greitens. I am the director of the Asia Policy Program here at UT Austin. I'm a faculty member at the LBJ School upstairs. The Asia Policy Program is a joint initiative of the Clements Center for National Security. Several of the team members from the Clements Center are in the room today, as well as the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, directed by Professor Adam Klein, who is also serving as the discussant on our first panel today. So I just wanted to acknowledge both the Clements and the Strauss Center for their support of the Asia Policy Program, as well as the staff in both centers that worked really hard to put the logistics of this event together for all of us today. I'm delighted that this year's collaboration and this year's workshop focuses on an issue that KEI identified early as a really critical area of cooperation between the United States and South Korea, and that's the role of critical and emerging technologies in the alliance. This is something that has increasingly come to the fore under the Yoon government and in the current administration, as it's become clear that critical and emerging technologies not only shape the face of modern conflict, but also provide new opportunities for international cooperation founded on science and technology, in particular for two countries that share really cutting-edge research and an interest in applying these technologies for the betterment of their citizens and of the world. So I'm really pleased today to have two panels and four distinguished panelists. I will let the panel moderators introduce each of them briefly and the titles of their papers, but we're looking at AEI, quantum, semiconductors, biotechnology, clean energy technology, really a wide array of science and technical domains that will shape a lot of the way the world functions and the way that countries both collaborate and compete in the future. So really, this is not only a growth area for the US ROK alliance, but something that is really critically important for the contours of world politics and the sort of shape of the international environment that's emerging. So again, we're really grateful to KEI for choosing to come and host this workshop at UT Austin. We look forward to the conference volume that will come out of it. And with that, I will hand it over to Clint for the opening remarks from KEI. Thanks so much for coming to join us today.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Could I ask So-young and Sang-hyun to come to join us? I'll keep my remarks very brief. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here in person, as well as on KEI's YouTube live stream. As Sheena mentioned, this is our second visit to UT Austin, where we put on a two-part panel as well last year, which features working drafts of papers that will later be published in KEI's flagship journal, Korea Policy. Last year's journal focused on different perspectives on economic security in the Indo-Pacific. And as Sheena mentioned, this fall's issue will focus on sort of a special issue on the US-South Korea alliance cooperation in areas of critical and emerging technology. And the papers today will focus, again, as Sheena mentioned, first on semiconductors and AI, and in our second panel on clean energy tech and markets in biotechnology and biomanufacturing. So we've put a lot under the hood, admittedly, for two panels, but we have a wonderful set of speakers to navigate the complexity of these issues. And one thing we really try to do with our Korea Policy Journal and the papers therein is to bring both established scholars and emerging scholars and folks who are in the think tank and policy analysis space to write for us. So we do get an array of different perspectives, and I think our panelists represent that very well today. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first panel. I want to thank Director Adam Klein of the Strauss Center for joining us as our discussant, and our two speakers, Dr. Kwon So-young and Han Sang-hyun, who is a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech University. And excuse me, Dr. Kwon is an associate professor at George Mason University in Korea. I've asked them, just in terms of run of show, each to give 10 or at most 12 minutes of sort of key takeaways from their working drafts. And after both of them have presented, we'll turn to Director Klein for his discussant remarks. And then we will open things up to a bit of a moderated discussion for our panelists to respond to the discussant and then to gather questions from you in the audience, both here and online. So with that, let me hand things over first to you, Sang-hyun.
Okay. So thank you, Clint, for the warmest regard, and thank you, KEI and the UT Strauss, Clements-Strauss Asia Policy Program for having me. My name is Sang-hyun again. I'm a doctoral student at the Semnon School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. I'm going to talk about USRK, AI, and quantum science technologies, but at the same time, I want to provide some clarification on three things. First one is actually AI is typically consists of algorithm, big data, and computing capacity, ABC. And the latter, computing capacity, is actually pretty much related to the semiconductor capabilities. So I kind of defer to Dr. Kwon's, her great analysis on semiconductor. So AI in this presentation refers to more about algorithm and big data collaborations. And second of all, this analysis uses only open source data. This implies that governmental cooperation, which is not publicized yet, is not included in the analysis. And last of all, the technology cooperation is defined in this presentation as a government-to-government joint technology efforts to cultivate the technology. So this presentation actually describes how USRK cooperation in given technology, specifically AI and quantum science, has been evolved. And I feel like there is a need to actually emphasize how AI and quantum science is critical. And I feel like just like 2 hours ago, White House actually announced that the U.S. National Security Memorandum on AI, calling for advancing international consensus and governance around AI, in addition to like 2 principles. And I feel like within this kind of statement, there is really necessity to collaborating with bilateral or even like multilateral settings with like-minded countries. And specifically, first of all, for the significance of technology is kind of dating back to 2021 joint statement between President Moon and President Biden. And in December 2023, a USRK Next Generation Critical Emerging Technology Dialogue is launched with a recognition of 6 technologies, and obviously 2 of which is AI and quantum science. And I feel like there is really great difference between how they describe as AI and quantum, and there's actually subtitle for each technology. And AI is actually labeled as an AI and standard, whereas quantum science is just quantum. So I feel like this really represents how both countries are perceiving their areas where they can collaborate in terms of each technology. So even before this dialogue launched in 2023, AI cooperation in standard is specifically mentioned in May 22 joint statement and August 2023 Camp Davis statement among USRK and Japan. And after this dialogue, National Institute of Standard and Technology and Korea Agency for Technology Standard, which both are responsible for designating and promulgating the international standards, is actually signed an MOU to facilitate their own collaboration on standardization process. And at the same time, American National Standard Institution begins to actually serve as a secretary for the subcommittee overseeing the AI standard under ISO and IEC, since the subcommittee was established. So there's kind of room for, there is a kind of a roles for the United States to actually contribute to AI standardization in international settings. And this, one of the South Korean institutions also responsible for the standard actually hosted 13 plenary sessions, and also specific standard on data quality assessment led by South Korea was actually adopted through these plenary sessions. Another kind of follow-up from this critical and emerging technology dialogue is actually both states actually launched a specific working group dedicated to AI called ROK US AI Working Group in April 2023 to kind of discuss agendas such as international norms, standard, and research collaborations. Yet until now, there is no publicized meeting after the inaugural one. And timing for the establishment is actually right before the two global summits that South Korea just hosted, which is the Global AI Summit and the Responsible Use of AI in the Military Domain Summit. So I kind of could imagine the focus might be international norm on the standard instead of actual research collaborations. So another kind of research collaboration within the AI technology between the two countries is trilateral cooperation, not a bilateral setting, with Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington, D.C., where U.S. national laboratories are participating. But according to the South Korean press briefing released, it kind of indicates that there is yet no concrete timeline or detailed plan as of now. So let's kind of switching to the quantum technology. So quantum technology shows very kind of different trajectory compared to the AI cooperation between two capitals. So May 22 statement between the head of U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Minister of Science and ICT explicitly recognize a research collaboration in quantum science area. As one of the research endeavor between both countries are actually Korea-U.S. Quantum Technology Center, which is established by the same ministry, Minister of Science and ICT, and launched 6 research clusters across United States and South Korea institutions, governmental bureaus, and universities with $4.5 million budget just for the 2022, and it will be expanded. And also, of course, the follow-up statement between the US OSTP and the Ministry of Science and ICT in April 2023, I feel like it's really epitomized the distinctive trajectory of technology cooperation in the quantum technology. In the statement, both states actually enunciated the US-RK Science Technology Cooperation Agreement signed it in 1999. This agreement kind of laid out the expert exchanges, knowledge acquisitions, and how to decide and share, divided a share of intellectual property. And I feel like in personal view, I think it really provides some very robust and formal foundations for the technology cooperation in general and quantum technology cooperation in specifically. And 11th joint committee meeting in May 2023, which was actually mandated by this science technology agreement, reaffirms their kind of research endeavors in quantum technology areas. And U.S. National Institute for Standard and Technology and also another research institute, governmental institute in South Korea actually agrees to pursue 2 joint research collaboration in January 2024. And in addition to this kind of bilateral setting, noticeably, U.S. spearheads a very vibrant international joint research initiative, such as entanglement exchanges, which South Korea became the latest member state, or Quantum Development Group, recently launched by Department of State and presided by Deputy Secretary Kurt Campbell to kind of foster coordinated multilateral approaches. So kind of just before summarizing the technology cooperation in quantum and AI and quantum between the South Korea and the United States, I don't kind of want to drive very decisive conclusions, and I don't also want to undermine the technology cooperation led by different actors other than government. So there are really numerous cases where South Korean private actors or governments are actually cooperating with United States private sectors. So for instance, Korea AI System IC Innovation Center, established by the Korea Ministry of Trade Industry and Energy in San Jose, California area, supports 5 United States firms to support and development AI and semiconductor relevant technologies. And same minister, Moti, established 5 global industrial technology centers within the U.S. research institutes, and Yale and MIT are actually selected for the particularly developing AI technology. Excuse me, matched with the South Korean research counterparts. And for your information, Georgia Tech is actually selected for the semiconductor. And recently, Vice Minister with the Undersecretary Jose Fernandez visited the research site after they hosted the US-RK public-private economic dialogue in Atlanta area, for the first time outside of the Washington, D.C. and Seoul, which is the capital of both countries. And also similarly in the quantum technology, standard cooperation akin to the AI technologies is actually another pillar, given that South Korea assumed the chairmanship of Joint Technical Committee on Quantum Technologies, also under the ISO and IEC. However, and kind of despite of all these various forms of cooperations, when it comes to government cooperation, which this presentation's interests are laid in, I think there's a distinguishable patterns between AI and quantum technologies, where cooperation in AI technology is more highlighting the standardization process and the standard making process as a normative approach, whereas the latter, quantum technology, touches more, I would say, practical and the tangible outcomes, research collaboration in particular. So I want to conclude by emphasizing, in addition to those kind of distinctive patterns between the AI and quantum technology, I want to emphasize the human factors in science and technology cooperation in general. I think human researchers and their expertise are like always, I think they're, I could say, like one of the most critical factors in S&T, science technology corporations. And they are actually always involved with technology development process and even the standardization process for the technology. And according to some data that I found, United States and South Korea has really advantages in both attracting and retaining this kind of human resources. So I think there might be some collaborative areas for both countries to enhance research environments by placing their strength and know-how. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here and to meet UT Austin students and faculty. I will look at the semiconductor supply chain and technology cooperation between the US and South Korea within an alliance framework. And I take questions whether states behave like allies when engaging in technological cooperation, and whether the existing alliance mechanism fit for the purpose of technological cooperation among allies and partners to discuss the development, opportunities, challenges, implications, and recommendations for moving forward within the global comprehensive strategic alliance within 10 minutes. I'll do my best. Well, starting from the trends surrounding the semiconductor supply chain and technological cooperation, like there has been deglobalization trend where cooperation has turned into severe competition based on techno-nationalism. And the countries that have relative strength in the semiconductor sectors and that used to be part of the global semiconductor ecosystem are now devising distinct strategies and goals for respective economic security based on their threat perception, concerns, and opportunities. The semiconductor supply chain is particularly an important case that's currently going through reconfiguration through friendshoring, reshoring, de-risking, et cetera. Another trend that I noticed is intensifying US-China competition in supply chain and also in semiconductors, and weaponization of interdependence, which made the semiconductor supply chain a critical component of national security. So having control over semiconductor technology underpins technological and military edge over peer competitors. Another trend that I find most interesting is the excessive securitization of the supply chain and key technologies like semiconductors. So security logics and discourse started to come into play with offensive strategies focused on growth and expansion, and defensive strategies focused on protection and stability, with overly used terms such as semiconductors alliance, technology alliance, Chip 4 alliance, et cetera. This blurs the distinction between traditional security arrangement and strategic cooperation in the new economic and technological domain. So looking at the US-ROK alliance and how it evolved over time within this framework really make me to pay attention to the new form of a global comprehensive strategic alliance between US and Korea, which is an upgrade of the traditional US-ROK alliance that focused primarily on military defense against external threat. And now that's evolving to include strategic partnership in semiconductor supply chains and advanced technologies. This concept is a byproduct of 2022 and 2023 US-ROK summits, where both countries pledged to enhance cooperation in critical and emerging technologies, such as semiconductors, AI, and clean energy. Whereas 2022 summit outlined broad commitment with the promise to continue working together to tackle immediate and long-term challenges in the supply chain ecosystem, the 2023 summit which coincided with the 70th anniversary of the U.S. Rock Alliance, not only reaffirmed that pledge, but transformed it into specific plans, including the establishment of important dialogues and working-level frameworks to implement the alliance goals in a more concrete and structured and tangible way. So with specific focus on semiconductors cooperation, I point out 3 achievements. Firstly, at the working level, I think progress has been made by collaborative efforts among governments, industries, and academic institutions. As Mr. Han mentioned, it seems like they are having official launch of the next generation CET dialogue to promote cooperation on semiconductors as well. And the partnership includes initiatives such as STEM exchange program to foster talent and joint R&D in cutting-edge semiconductor technologies. So that brings about innovation centers and semiconductor innovation centers at major U.S. universities, U.S. National Semiconductor Technology Center, and then Korean Advanced Semiconductor Technology Center that's in process of being, it's going through bidding process by the cities. Second achievement is enhancing the public-private partnership, assuring a more predictable environment for business activities and Korean chip makers, bold investment in the U.S. The ministerial level supply chain commercial dialogue has led substantive progress with the working groups, including deepening semiconductor investment cooperation. That includes signing non-binding memoranda with Samsung to have leading-edge ecosystem in Central Texas. Also, it's a SKC Apolix having its foundations facilities in Georgia. So. Overall, it seems like it's actually providing semiconductors in details in key areas of supply chain through U.S.-Korea Forum. And it's discussing on the way to cooperate with workforce development and R&D. Thirdly, it encouraged Korea to actively participate in the U.S.-led multilateral and minilateral efforts for enhancing supply chain resiliency or detecting potential disruption in global supply chains or ensuring stable access to critical technologies and materials. So from July this year, South Korea has been holding chairmanship in Mineral Security Partnership and also became an inaugural chair leading the Crisis Response Network under IPF supply chain agreement. So overall, the combined efforts at both leadership level and working level has deepened the US-ROK alliance beyond its defense to address critical global supply chain challenges. But they have also broadened the alliance in the sense that in engaging US-led minilateral initiatives like IPEF and MSP to strengthen semiconductor supply chain resilience and counter China's growth or possible economic coercion coming from China. So what are the implications? I think this alliance serves as a vital platform that aligns and coordinates the shared interests of both countries, and it fosters great cooperation in supply chain management and technology. It definitely helps South Korea to diversify its semiconductor supply chain, find access to a new market, lessen its dependency on China, and enhance international partnership. However, there are concerns and apprehension over the application of alliance to the new domains. As you may be aware, that the concept of alliance and partnership differs significantly in terms of the level of institutionalization, the nature of commitment, and the range of cooperation for the agreed purposes. So traditionally, alliances like US-ROK relationship were grounded in a formal agreement based on treaty, or military cooperation and mutual defense against external threat. Under these partnership focus, but unlike traditional military alliances, the partnership focused more on leveraging shared resources, knowledge, and capability to enhance the competitive advantages of each partner. So traditional alliance mechanisms that are not fully aligned with the evolving goals of technological partnership, and even traditional alliance framework were not designed to fully address the complexity of economic and technological interdependence. So there are issues over sharing concerns on threat, entrapment and abandon dilemmas for Korea, collective resilience and deterrence problems, and most importantly, domestic political environment, particularly with the uncertainty coming from the US presidential election. I would not want to go into details, but I would like to point out that there still is a compatibility issue, which is the key, between the value-based alliance and profit-based cooperation, which again pose challenges in the public-private collaboration in economic and technological cooperation. A value-based alliance, sometimes overly calling for countering authoritarian states and maintaining the international liberal order, does not always align with the economic incentives of the private sector that primarily seek absolute profit. And that makes it very difficult to apply fully the national security logic to private sector behavior. However, private firms are important actors. So we have to take into account that corporate interests do not always coincide with state interests. So in terms of recommendation, the upgrade of the alliance to Global Comprehensive Strategic Alliance means a transition from a security relationship focused on common threat to a strategic partnership based on mutual interest. So the sustainability and effectiveness of the evolving alliance depends on converging economic interests to enable deeper integration of supply chains and technological collaboration. And this requires the careful balance of mutual interest, clear communication, and adaptable strategy that consider the diverse needs and perception of allies and partners. So for a path forward, I think the alliance serves as a crucial platform for integration, coordination, and joint initiatives among member states. I think the US and South Korea must continue to enable enhanced bilateral dialogues, foster public-private partnership for innovation through joint R&D, and build a resilient, secure, and innovative semiconductor supply chain. So by working together, I hope they can maintain their competitive edge and contribute to regional economic order that reduces vulnerability and promotes long-term economic security. I would like to finish my talk with the catchphrase or motto of US-ROC Alliance, 같이 갑시다, we go together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kwon. You've made my job as moderator very easy. You've been very disciplined in your time. So I want to pass things over to our discussion, Director Klein.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the two distinguished professors for their papers, which I very much enjoyed reading and I learned a great deal from. I certainly recommend them to all of you if you haven't had a chance to read them yet. I will try to organize my comments thematically instead of simply running chronologically through my comments that emerged from the papers. The first theme that emerged to me is what is our job as academics and analysts versus the job of the diplomats who craft these very nice-sounding collaborative statements. Both papers did a great job of recounting the recent history of symmetry between the US and Korea, various high-minded, well-intentioned statements about intentions to collaborate and so forth. I thought the papers were at their strongest, however, when they diverged from what diplomats do, which is trying to mask friction in relationships with pretty language and exposing those friction points and analyzing them. Just to give an example, for example, and we'll get to this later, some of the latent anxieties on the Korean side about the US push for sharpened cooperation vis-a-vis China to exclude China from certain supply chains. That's an awkward friction point that the diplomats don't want to come out in the summit communiques. But for our purposes as analysts, our job is to really dig into those pain points, to go to the pain, as a former boss of mine used to say, and help the decision makers ultimately understand those pain points so that we can address them in ways that are genuinely durable and not simply kick down the road. So I would encourage both authors to even further sharpen their judgments, not just about the symmetry, but about some of the cooperation mechanisms on things like quantum, for example. There are various nice little cooperation initiatives. Do these things actually make a difference? how much do these matter compared to, for example, the volume of private capital that's being thrown at some of these problems? Are these just nice sounding things that fill out the bullet point list at the end of the diplomatic communique, or are they really going to fundamentally change the innovation environment? Second, someone mentioned today the National Security Memorandum on AI, which just came out, and there's a lot of discussion, especially in Professor Han's paper, about cooperation on governance. And again, this is one of those things that people in Washington and people in Brussels love to talk about. We're collaborating on shaping the rules, et cetera. Well, some people in Washington at least. And I would encourage you to think about the dichotomy between collaboration on governance, which is largely serves the purpose of maintaining control over technology by the people who are writing the communiques, and collaborating on innovation, which in many cases requires surrendering control, or at least foregoing control. Which of those ultimately is the better determinant of success in a technology race, in a technology competition? I spend a lot of time looking at EU-US data privacy, data transfers, and the innovation environment. And I can tell you, I don't know if you know about the Draghi report coming out of Mario Draghi about the EU's innovation environment. They have a great governance environment. The collaboration is fantastic. U.S. officials love to fly to Brussels and have a good dinner and chit-chat about privacy and cooperation on AI standards and so forth. But the innovation environment is terrible. And when we think, where do we want this relationship to be in 25 years in this realm, in this technology alliance that's emerging, should we care more about the governance cooperation or the innovation environment that we're working together to create? On that point, before I leave this second point, the role of the private sector is something that I would focus more heavily on in future drafts of the paper. One quote that I pulled out here is that private sector-led cooperation is not a form of technology cooperation unless these initiatives are elevated or strongly endorsed by both governments. Two reactions that I had to that. First, they often will be elevated or strongly endorsed. You've seen that in the Quad, for example. Trying to plug private sector actors together is frankly one of the more useful things that government bureaucrats and officials can do when meeting about these things. And second, they're important just by virtue of the weight that private sector actions have in determining the innovation future. And again, if you look at the US-EU dynamics, all of these summits, all of these communiques, ultimately what matters is which countries have innovated and put themselves in the lead on things like cloud, on things like apps and social media, and now on things like AI. That is the key determinant of who has power and what the environment looks like that the countries are working in. So I'd really focus on this private sector factor. Let's see. And some other examples that you might look at: cross-border venture investment, M&A activity between the countries. Obviously, FDI is huge. We know that there's massive FDI coming in here in Central Texas, which we're very happy about. Is there any going the other way? Are there other examples? But again, most of the dynamic innovation here is taking place in the private sector on both of the key technologies, specifically for Professor Han, that you're looking at in your paper. What do policymakers care about here? What American policymakers care about, obviously, is the security of the supply chains, but especially focused on choke points, key choke points. So that's advanced node chips. It's things like the NVIDIA bottleneck for advanced AI chips, right? This monopoly, the quasi-monopoly that NVIDIA has, and the dependence there, for example, on TSMC to be the foundry that is manufacturing those chips. Can Korean investment and tech cooperation help address those top-of-mind problems is a question that you could engage with a bit more. Third point is coalition dynamics. I thought actually the papers did a very good job of bringing this out. I absolutely agree. It's hard not to agree with the premise that technology markets are splintering based on geopolitical factors. That is a decisive phenomenon that I think both papers faced up to admirably and did a good job of exploring the discomforts with. For those who haven't read the paper, Professor Kwan's paper had a great quote from Jake Sullivan, which somehow I had missed to my shame, and I'll try to summarize it. He said, "The economic losses suffered by allied and partner countries for joining the U.S. industrial policy driven by national security concerns should be considered as part of the shared defense burden. So basically the point is, we're telling you, you have to move away from China on these technologies. That's going to cost you some money, and you just have to suck that up, because that's part of being on the good team for purposes of this global values and security competition. Professor Kwon, you were sort of critical of that statement, and it was insensitive to Koreans' concerns. I understand that, but I actually give Jake Sullivan credit for saying the thing that needs to be said. This is not Donald Trump saying this. This is Jake Sullivan saying this. If Jake Sullivan is saying this, something that sounds like it could have come out of the mouth of a Trump administration official, this isn't going to be an enduring feature of American policy. It would be very, very hard to explain to Americans in this populist and nationalist age why we should be expending resources and taking on massive risk to our homeland to partner with countries that are profiting off of relations with the country that is preparing to attack us and kill our sailors and our airmen in the Asia Pacific. That is just an enduring reality of the world that we're living with, and I think it was great that you raised it in the paper, and we have to confront it head on as part of these coalition dynamics. I also think the papers did a superb job of talking about, and this was interesting for me, the Korean anxieties related to some of these American demands and how Korea is trying to, very understandably, finesse the American demand for increased distance from China, for separating the supply chains with the economic realities of close integration with China in many ways economically, but also just simple proximity and desire not to be forced to take too decisive of a stand. So very understandable. I also thought, and I won't dwell on this, it was interesting to see the differences between the Japanese perspective on economic sovereignty and supply chains and the Korean perspective. Some of those subtleties came out really well in the paper. I won't recount them, but I would recommend that you all read the paper. And then under this coalition dynamics, a final point about the differences between an economic alliance and a security alliance. I thought that was very interesting. So for example, if we're claiming that we have this economic alliance with great solidarity and collective defense, what kind of promises can we credibly make to defend our economic allies against hostile economic action, as for example happened when the THAAD battery was rolled out near Seoul and China took these various hostile economic actions against Korea. We know that in the military context, if there's an armed attack, it's reasonably clear what rises to the level of triggering your treaty obligations, and it's also reasonably clear what you're expected to do in response: repel the armed attack, help your ally preserve its sovereignty. Both of those are much less clear in an economic alliance, and of course there are going to be powerful domestic constituencies against keeping your economic alliance promises in some cases. So figuring out what those alliance dynamics look like that's a very interesting frontier of research, and I think the more you can say concretely about that, the greater service these papers will provide to policymakers. I think that's enough. I'll stop there. Hopefully we can have some questions.
Thank you very much, Director Klein. That was, you hit on some really key points, especially that last one you made was a conversation So-young and I were having earlier today and in some of the editorial process. Just one quick point. The papers will be available for folks to read around mid-November. So unfortunately, the only folks who've read them are those involved in the panel, but stay tuned. And just one quick follow-up, and I want to have both of you respond to the discussant's remarks. We tasked our writers with charting the top-level statements, the nice-sounding statements, as Director Klein rightly pointed out. What progress has been made since they've been made? What sort of opportunities there are, but also what challenges and obstacles are ahead, or the pain points, as Director Klein rightly mentioned. So that's something I would be interested to hear both of you maybe weigh in on and some more, but also your other responses as well. And then we'll turn to our audience if you have questions. So if you do have a question, when we get to you, please raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for the, I think it was like superb comments that I received. So I will just like raise my response by question. So first question is about, I think Clint really nicely mentioned about what kind of our job to actually, what is the purpose of this paper. And I was actually, for me, the main aim for the paper while I'm writing was actually trying to charting the cooperation between the United States and South Korea in AI quantum technology. And after I kind of analyzing those cooperation areas, I thought, okay, why there's a variations. Well, there is like, I can say there's a distinctive patterns between those two technologies and why so case. And for the sake of the time, to be honest, I don't have like deep dive into those like why questions, but as a political science doctoral student, I'm actually planning to launch this like technology cooperation as a my other academic project, and also like this kind of project is stemmed from, there's like so many perceptions of technologies perceived as more like a tools for competition rather than collaborations or corporations. And my kind of personal impression is technology cannot be solely developed by a single country. Although like some United States notably have a very superiorities or predominance in like AI and quantum areas, but at the same time, they actually need some corporations from other countries, even including like-minded countries and also even from adversaries such as China. So my kind of impression is technology is areas where they can also collaborate or cooperate with each other rather than, in addition to perceive as more like a tool for the competitions. So that's kind of, I think you really nicely laid out my future job in addition to this paper. So stay tuned for that as well. And also your points about the collaborations between the government and the governance and the innovation, I think that's really hits my point as well. But also during my analysis, I feel like there is some kind of weird situation where I think we are really standing on the weird situation where before this kind of critically emerging technologies, my kind of personal also impression or analysis is there is a like private sector-led technology development in addition to government subsidizing those areas. So government is not like central actors. And I know there is kind of a debate between whether government was a central actor, but my kind of point is government is actually just behind the scene and just providing some subsidies or actually providing some expertise on private sectors. But I feel like current situations where this kind of emerging technology is becoming like too much securitized, government is trying to actually control over those kind of technologies in addition to what, letting private sectors do what they have to do. So I think there is kind of like mixed gray area where government is trying to handling both collaboration on governance and innovation, meaning they're trying to hold the grips on the technologies, but also at the same time forging some portions of the technology into the private sectors. And I also I feel like I did like really kind of bad jobs on defining the technology cooperation in my paper, because the quote that you use is actually from my paper. So I want to kind of provide some clarifications on that. So technology cooperation in my paper and the presentation is specifically focusing on the government-to-government cooperation. The reason why is actually based on the thoughts that I have, based on that I laid out previously. I personally think government-to-government technology cooperation is pretty much unique and distinctive compared to what we usually saw as a technology cooperation between private sectors. And in this paper, at least in this paper, compared to like other kind of scholarly articles or policy papers, things like that, I really want to focusing on governmental roles and governmental influence over technologies instead of injecting private sectors. So that kind of might readers to kind of having some confusions about technology cooperations. And I think the role of the private sector is really critical, but in this paper, and for the sake of this analysis, is more focusing on the technology between the governmental actors. Yeah, I think that's all for my responses. And again, thanks for the great comments. And I'll hand over to Dr. Cohen.
Well, rather than answering question one by one, I would actually lump them together to make some points. Firstly, academics' role. I think this is what really needs, like somebody to have critical voice over what are the fundamental problems and challenges and gaps, especially bringing alliance theories to understand, what this technology alliance really means. And I think that really helps the audience to understand that there are some gap that is creating some misunderstanding between the two countries and to the public as well. In terms of, I do a project to interview public sector and private sectors in Korea. So after meeting 10 different people, my conclusion was their understanding of economic security was completely different. And at times, private sectors are ahead of the government. They read the environment very quickly, they adapt quickly. So in that sense, I don't think there's a separation between governance cooperation and innovation cooperation. It seems like they feed on each other. It seems like they have to actually go together. And public-private collaboration was definitely something that the field was something that we struggled with in the beginning, but after the 2022-2023 summit, it seems like that concerns were somehow elevated. So it seems like the summit and then the new comprehensive strategic alliance tended to give that room for enhanced public-private partnership, collaboration, and especially private sector collaboration between the US and Korea. So in that sense, I find this alliance format, well, even though it's not a treaty, it really gave the platform for dialogues and for collaboration, so I find that very positive. Some of the comments that that Dr. Klein mentioned, I would like to mention this before closing my comments. A state engaged in alliance must always consider the prospect of being abandoned by its ally for non-cooperation. And I think that put Korea in a very sensitive position because we do have a dual dependence where we depend on US for security, but we depend on China for its market and trade. And therefore, we were really concerned about non-cooperation, which can lead to abandon. But at the same time, we're concerned about potential entrapment in allies disputes with other states, and being caught between U.S. and China was definitely an uncomfortable position for us. At the same time, I think Korea is very sensitive about China's potential economic retaliation. I don't think China is realistically, China is ready to come up with any particular strong coercion, but at the same time, Korea is worried that the alliance mechanism or strategic partnership will not be able to provide enough collective deterrence or responses for us. And because there's no clear, well-institutionalized framework, collective deterrence is something that that gives various challenges for our current Korea. I think most important thing, concern that Korea has at the moment is the U.S. presidential election and the return of candidate at the moment, Donald Trump, and especially if he's reelected, there might be a potential shift toward more protectionist policies and more fair share rhetoric that can perhaps disrupt the existing framework of economic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific when Korea just stepped in to be more actively engaged. So with that, those concerns at the moment, I think, I hope this alliance can, sort of strengthen the partnership and collaboration between the two countries and relieve all the concerns that Koreans have. And that's probably another thing that academics should do in order to explore in these different challenges.
We are coming up against time. I want to defer to our host, Sheena, who has a question.
I'll keep my question brief. I did want to follow up on this issue of the role of the private sector, and I guess I would encourage, and I did have a chance to read the papers, but I wanted to encourage you to think about the various ways in which the private sector affects political leaders' incentives for particular types of technology cooperation. And I say that as someone who co-led a state-level trade mission to South Korea in the fall of 2017, and signed a memorandum of understanding as part of that with the Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises. So I think that there are multiple routes by which the private sector shapes the domestic constituencies for particular types of governance cooperation, and that particularly at the subnational level in the United States, the role of the private sector in shaping the incentives of political actors who put the foundation under the sort of State Department, the bilateral cooperation agreements, is an important way to think about it. So the papers focus on research collaboration, they focus on public-private partnerships, but there's also the sort of subnational impact of private sector activity that shapes politics from the bottom up through the role of domestic constituencies. And I guess I would encourage, maybe as you think about the role of the private sector in both innovation and governance, which I think is really an important distinction to at least discuss and highlight in the papers. That's one potential way to come at it. So just wanted to offer that as a thought, and then I don't know if we have time for a question or two before we turn over.
We built in a 5-minute buffer, so if there is any question in-house, I know we have no questions online. Is there anybody in here who has a question they'd like to pose?
Can I respond to the Trump point?
All right, please do. That will be our closing point.
So perhaps people are worrying about the re-election of former President Trump, but worrying doesn't do anything. As many a self-help guru will tell you, you have to take action. And so if President Trump is re-elected, the question is, what is Korea's plan for reassuring the United States about these burden sharing, the benefits of trade and so forth? We won't speak today to military burden sharing that's beyond the scope, but the massive Korean FDI into the United States, especially the Samsung investment here in Central Texas, is a great illustration that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. So perhaps invite President Trump, if he's reelected, to come down to the Austin area and visit the massive plant that's being built and the $40+ billion of investment. That's a great way to illustrate mutual benefit.
Thank you, Director Klein. I want to thank our panelists and Director Klein again for a stimulating discussion, which of course could have gone on another half hour or hour. Thank you very much, everyone. And let's just jump right into our second panel. Just very briefly, our second panel will cover. It is, excuse me. Clean energy technology and markets, as well as biotechnology and biomanufacturing cooperation in the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And on the first subject is Elon Sykes, who's the Director of Energy and Climate Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. And covering biotechnology and manufacturing is Zina Nisar, who's a policy analyst for the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology. And we're very pleased to have as our discussant, Dr. Joshua Busby, who's a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center and a fellow with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, as well as a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security. So same run of show as we had in the first panel. Our first speakers were so disciplined that they set a high bar, so I hope our second speakers keep it.
10 minutes to is this on? 10 minutes to discuss climate change policy is a tall order, but I'll do my best. 10 to 12, exactly. I'm really glad to be talking about bilateral climate cooperation at a critical emerging technology conference. I think that as a frame for approaching the climate problem. There are lots of different discursive and analytical frames you can take to think about the problem, but I like to think about climate as an intersection between technological and physical developments, resource challenges, and just the physical scientific reality of climate change and the need to respond to it and mitigate its impacts to the greatest extent possible. But it's also crucial for economic growth, for economic distribution of income implications, export competitiveness, and security implications as well. Climate is such a live issue. Security and energy security threats are taking such a vivid form these days following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of global gas markets. The rise of China's policy of EV subsidies and dominance in the market for precursor materials to batteries. And while I didn't talk about those background factors so much in the paper, I think it's really important to account for all of these sort of systemic interlinked issues when you approach climate. And on top of that, you have really serious political, infrastructural, and political institutions that control domestic policy. So in the US, some of those important constraints include the filibuster in the Senate, the Electoral College, but also sort of the federal bureaucratic apparatus that's responsible for environmental review and permitting for projects is really right now acting as a brake on our deployment of clean energy technologies, whereas Korea's situation is quite different. The politics of climate change are not as polarized between the parties, but we're just dealing with quite different industrial, electric grid, and just natural resource endowment challenges. And multilateral climate policy is really hard because you have different countries with different levels of interest and capability in addressing climate change. And different comparative advantages in markets. But that's also why I think technological cooperation on the bilateral level can be so fruitful, specifically in clean energy technology, because as you align on standards for technical operation, safety, and carbon accounting, the larger your market is, and the more aligned you are on incentives to develop and deploy those technologies, the bigger a market and the better off you'll be. The US and South Korea have very complementary capabilities in some of these sectors. The US is really terrible at building ships, at installing offshore wind turbines. Korea's geography is not great for installing fixed offshore wind, but they're great at building ships. Nuclear reactor exports, not something that the US has specialized in a long time. I'll get to that in a bit. But I think at a highest level, my frame for cooperation on the bilateral level is clean energy pragmatism, which involves thinking specifically within the context of the problem that you're trying to solve, what the nature of the problem and the systemic implications are, and also what your political, social, technical, economic constraints are that are going to shape what you're trying to do in order to solve those problems. And so that's why I have somewhat different recommendations for all three of the technology areas that I speak about. But I think they're undergirded by a common frame in the uncertainties about the right technology pathways for different countries to achieve decarbonization, and also the necessity of policy to drive that shift in conjunction with investment and innovation from the private sector. I at times find myself jealous of other countries' state capacities and their ability to implement policy and work collaboratively with the private sector. I think the US is getting better at that. Whether we stay the course after the next 2 weeks or not, I think is a big open question. But I think because the US private sector is so innovative and states also sometimes have the power to drive climate policy, not all will be lost. And I think actually tech development and cooperation at the subnational level will be even more important under a Trump presidency than under a Harris presidency. But I think in general, the US and South Korea have been very effective at cooperating at the government and private level on clean energy technology, multiple summits where clean energy issues are raised at the highest level, climate mitigation, but also specific technology, including batteries, hydrogen, and nuclear, which are the technologies I discuss in the paper, but also other topics that have borne less fruit but will be just as important in the future, like green shipping, bringing down the cost curve for carbon capture and storage, and other topics, or other technologies, excuse me. And so I think that the three areas that I've set out to focus on are the most important, but that's not to say that these are the only technologies within climate that we should think about. In battery investments, I think the battery supply chain is one of the biggest successes of the Inflation Reduction Act in the past few years in the U.S. As a climate story. And Korea actually 10 years ago was the second biggest exporter to the world of batteries. Since then, China has really expanded its industry so much that especially in the critical mineral refining segment in the middle of the battery supply chain, they control anywhere from 50 to 100% of the market for the refined products that you need in order to make the components in order to assemble the battery cells into packs and then get them into an electric vehicle or connected to the grid. The US and South Korea have been extremely effective at cooperating on raw resource agreements, both bilaterally through dialogues at the ministerial and presidential level, and also in the private sector and through shared fora like the Mineral Security Partnership, which was mentioned in the earlier panel. I think it's not quite appreciated that the MSP was founded by the State Department. It was really the current State Department's baby. The fact that Korea has taken over as the second chair of the MSP, I think is underappreciated as a sign that this really has some institutional legs. They've been very effective. Both the MSP is the partnership of countries that want to import more critical minerals. And then there's also the MSP Forum for resource-rich nations that has really allowed for better cooperation with countries that just are lucky enough to have, say, cobalt, lithium, copper. I think the critical minerals discourse is not just one that is important for climate change. It's also really important for things like aerospace and national security uses. But at least in the battery supply chain specifically, we've seen huge diplomatic and financial investments in raw material extraction and in final cell assembly, but not in those critical in-between choke points, you might call them, that are crucial if we're actually going to overcome the supply risks from China dominating the market. You know, if we were to be cut off from Chinese graphite or other refined minerals where they're really dominant in the market, the US and Korea would suffer. Today, actually, the 45X tax credit for critical minerals and other clean energy manufacturing production guidance was released, so I'll be happy to add some new policy progress on mineral processing to the final version of the paper. And then it remains to be seen the success of those initiatives, but I'm heartened by that. The other two technology areas, the progress is a bit more mixed. Korea's hydrogen policy has been extremely successful at encouraging adoption of hydrogen in power generation, in building the world's largest hydrogen vehicle market, which the US has not succeeded in. But because of policy uncertainties in the rollout of the domestic tax credit, difficulties with the carbon accounting standards for the hydrogen tax credit in the US, we really have not yet succeeded in launching investment in green or blue hydrogen or in uses of green and blue hydrogen for energy applications. Hydrogen is very important for existing chemical markets as a molecule, as a material input. And so we need to decarbonize the hydrogen that we use for things like fertilizer. But part of the reason that we're investing so much in hydrogen in the US is because people believe that it has a lot of potential as an energy carrier. And recent research that has come out since I first wrote the draft of this paper, that once you account for distribution and storage costs, a lot of these energy carrier applications go way up in cost of abatement compared even to direct air capture and CCUS. So these are really important questions. And in the paper draft, I called for cooperation on R&D for applications and for materials, equipment, and parts. But I really just think that the value of hydrogen to the energy system is an open question that I definitely can't answer on my own. Nuclear is another area where there's a lot of progress at the government level, but not in the private sector. There's a split between Westinghouse and the Korean nuclear company KHNP over exports of KHNP's APR 1000 designed to Czechia. But we need to find a way, at least at the policy level, to smooth over some of those disputes and deploy more nuclear power in order to meet rising electricity demand. In AI specifically, a lot of tech firms in the U.S. have started procuring power from nuclear plants that were going to retire or have retired, and some are even investing upfront in new reactor designs. And not just AI, but also electrified manufacturing, transportation, heating and cooling, and things, and new innovative energy technologies like green hydrogen, direct air capture are going to need lots of energy in the future. And so nuclear is incredibly helpful for those applications. But I think in the Korean context, nuclear has seen sort of a flip-flop in terms of the previous administration wanting to phase out nuclear, and the current administration restarting new nuclear investments. But I think for such an export-oriented, energy-intensive economy, also with a small grid with limited ability currently to integrate higher shares of renewable resources, that for Korea specifically, maintaining and expanding the nuclear sector to provide carbon-free, reliable power is really, really important. And I think with that, I'll wrap up.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Zena. I should start off as any good government employee by saying that I'm here in my personal capacity and I'm not representing any organization or institution that I am affiliated with. So I am a scientist by training, and so I'll start off by kind of providing a little bit of a definition that, when we defined biotechnology here, we define it as the use of biology to create new products, methods, and using living organisms to create these new processes. Biotechnology is a critical component of this new global comprehensive strategic alliance, and it is because biotechnology can be deployed across a wide variety of sectors: agricultural, medical, industrial, et cetera. And biomanufacturing in particular holds the potential to onshore critical supply chains for materials and medicines through alternative production capacity. And so this offers a strategic advantage that should be noted when we are thinking about the US-South Korea strategic alliance. So robust biotechnology capabilities offer strategic advantages in achieving economic and supply chain security, and have a role to play in the securitization of technology development. Both the US and South Korea share very strong mutual interests in pursuing these aims against the backdrop of a rising and technologically advancing China. And it should be no surprise that these drivers and these aims for biotechnology development feature quite prominently in national level and in working level commitments between the two countries. I think in terms of when we look at the national level commitments, biotechnology is often featured, in addition to AI, quantum, as fora of critical technology development for the US and South Korea to foster increased cooperation. We see this with the US-South Korea Next Generation Critical and Emerging Technology Dialogue. We also see this in trilateral commitments as well between the US, South Korea, and India. It's interesting to see how these commitments serve as very strong demand-side signals to industry to kind of follow course. And so, on the sidelines of the 2023 dialogue and President Yoon's state visit, the Korea Biotechnology Industry Organization signed an MOU with the US Biotechnology Innovation Organization to strengthen ties in the bioeconomy. And this should be underscored by the fact that these organizations represent 12,000 and 6,000 biotechnology firms, respectively, in the industry. And so you see the industry falling quickly and kind of deliberately in line with these commitments. We also see this being reflected in research commitments. We see institutions, both in the US and South Korea, either generating new commitments or reaffirming commitments to cooperate in R&D efforts in pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biomanufacturing, AI research in healthcare, and biomaterials. Kind of going further into when we look at, okay, these commitments have been made, now what is the tractable metrics? Where is the progress been made in this strategic alliance and in this cooperation between the US and South Korea? And I think when you take stock of the commercial and financial ties between the two countries in this industry, there have been substantial commitments and progress made in kind of pursuing this mutual economic growth and technological innovation in biotechnology. We see from a top line, two-way foreign direct investment, on the rise and quite significant. The South Korea capital invested in the US economy last year reached record highs, more than any other country, and surpassing Taiwan. We're also seeing an uptick in investments for production capacity. South Korea's SK Bioscience has invested $2 million in US sunflower therapeutics for vaccine manufacturing. You see US investments going the other way into South Korea for production facilities related to biotechnology. South Korean pharmaceutical firms have also increased their efforts to expand their market presence in the United States. It should be notable that we're seeing an increase in mergers and acquisitions of US firms by South Korean pharmaceutical firms. In venture capital, we were also seeing this similar kind of trend of this growing connective tissue between the innovation ecosystems. In 2022, the US-based Orange Grove Bio and the South Korea-based SV Investment established a new partnership for joint biotech collaboration in sourcing and developing therapeutics. I think when we look at, again, this backdrop of a rising China and these concerns around supply chain security, there are significant opportunities to continue deepening cooperation. Both nations share kind of mutual interests and mutual aims in building supply chain resiliency, economic security, and secure development of this critical sector amidst rising tensions with China and given current vulnerabilities in the supply chains. Both nations face vulnerabilities with their active pharmaceutical ingredients, their APIs, and their biomanufacturing. You know, two areas where China has a significant presence in the global supply chain. And so both the US and South Korea have mutual interest in kind of building more resiliency. Both the US and South Korea have set targets domestically to develop this capacity for API production. And so building on this momentum, given the mutual interest, there is certainly an opportunity there to expand the strategic alliance and to expand cooperation in this area. I think also, given recent developments in legislation in the US for the Biosecure Act and the need for contract development manufacturing organizations outside of what's available with WuXi Biologics and BGI in China, there is an opportunity for South Korea and the US to enhance cooperation with production capacity. Gearing towards another sector as well, I wanted to look at agricultural biotechnology. And so what's interesting here is that there are some barriers that remain to market entry between the two countries that, you know, if alleviated, could enhance cooperation in terms of agricultural trade. South Korea's regulatory system is currently a barrier to the export of US agricultural biotechnology. And the approval process for American biotechnology agricultural products to South Korea faces a long kind of drawn out process that includes 5 different agencies. And so that is another tractable area of biotechnology cooperation that could be developed and kind of acted upon. There are also, given the mutual interest in supply chain security and resiliency, opportunities for the US and South Korea to act in tandem and to pursue common diplomatic efforts and multilateral coalitions. We see this with the trilateral critical and emerging technology dialogue with India for API production, where API production actually, there is an opportunity to kind of enhance cooperation, include India's API production capacity, and develop kind of mutually beneficial security aims. There's also a recent coalition developed, spearheaded by the US State Department for the Bio-5 to address drug shortages, to which South Korea is a participant. And so within those multilateral coalitions, and given our kind of common interest between the two countries, there's certainly an opportunity there for the US and South Korea to kind of act in tandem. I think others have kind of hinted here, there are challenges to deepening cooperation in this sector from the top level. You know, I think what's top of mind for a lot of folks is political shifts in election, but also what's another kind of consideration to have is how domestic economic needs could constrain, I think, common interests in economic security and how we define national security vis-a-vis supply chains. There are also considerations and constraints when we frame supply chain security and the biotechnology industry within this perspective of a rising China that, you know, there are some differences in how the US and South Korea perceive China's rise, and with China's rise, potential threat. I think the US has made those ties between economic security and supply chain security with national security a little more tighter, and made that rationale quite tight for industry. Whether or not South Korea will share those perspectives and to what extent will we see the domestic effects in South Korea is yet to be seen. I also think, again, kind of adding on to that potential difference in rationale between the economic security and the national security perspectives between the US and South Korea. This is where we really could see economic realities domestically for both nations, whether it's the inflation concerns in the US or South Korea's demographic shifts kind of potentially constraining this alliance, this area of cooperation. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Okay. Thanks. Delighted to be with you all today. Both of these papers provide good reportage on efforts between the U.S. and South Korea to cooperate on alternatives to Chinese dominant supply chains on batteries and biotechnology. There's also the discussion on nuclear power and hydrogen, where I think Chinese dominance is less acute. I think they're both animated by accepting the premise that Chinese dominance of supply chains is potentially a security risk that both countries want to address. At the very least, the U.S. sees South Korea as a helpful ally with manufacturing capabilities that might allow it to ease its reliance on China. I do think that in both papers, there could be a bit more upfront substantiation of what the U.S. is worried about with respect to dependence on China for supply chains. That's maybe more relevant, as I said, in the battery section in the clean energy paper, which, again, also covers hydrogen and nuclear power. For example, in the biotech paper, Korean and U.S. dependence on China's imported active pharmaceutical ingredients, or API, doesn't really appear until page 9 of the paper. And I think that might be useful as background earlier on, but as a sort of chapeau to say, like, what is it that countries are worried about? I think one takeaway from all of this is I wonder about whether or not the U.S.-Korea collaboration is likely to work. I think the starting position is that reducing dependence on China is desirable, but how far do we take that? It feels like to me that the conversation about, we initially started talking about decoupling some years ago of supply chains, U.S. and Chinese supply chains. I think there was a pullback from that in the sense that people realized that was probably unrealistic, and so the nomenclature and discussion started changing from decoupling to de-risking and supply chain diversification. But politically, I think the drive, the end place politically might be actually decoupling. And it's going to be very hard to sustain politically any sorts of supply chain linkages with China and the U.S. And I think that's going to be a major source of friction, particularly with Korea, if there are efforts to try to collaborate both in the energy space and the biotechnology space. But coming, as we think about how far do we take that and whether or not these efforts are likely to work, as the paper mentioned in the energy and climate paper, the U.S. is overwhelmingly reliant on Chinese graphite. And that dependence is such that the rules for foreign entities of concern, which is the rule to try to reduce Chinese suppliers from the Inflation Reduction Act, battery supply chain eligibility, that rule was sort of given an extension until 2026. And the paper talks about how Korea has put a lot of money into battery supply chains, including graphite. But I wonder if there's the sense whether this is going to be successful. And another way, the paper talks about there are a lot of investments in the U.S. From Korean companies in both finished batteries, but also in electric vehicles. And I wonder, there's an emergent new battery chemistry that's lithium iron phosphate, which avoids use of nickel and cobalt. And it's not clear to me that Korean companies know how to make that emergent battery chemistry. And so I wonder, is all this stuff going to ultimately pan out? So because of that reliance on Chinese inputs or suppliers for parts of the supply chain, you noted how China has a kind of stranglehold on minerals processing. I wonder if it's realistic or even sought to totally cut Chinese suppliers out of the supply chain. I'm not sure if that's where Korean manufacturers are, and certainly private sector manufacturers in the U.S. see the writing on the wall, but I think that they're also reluctant to be pushed in that direction as well. And certainly the biotech paper makes plain that China is an important trading partner for Korea. So avoiding efforts that unnecessarily antagonize China may be desirable from the Korean perspective, but politically it may be challenging for the U.S. to figure out an accommodation that is in both countries' interest. Because I think ultimately there's some segments where it may be virtually impossible to proceed without some Chinese inputs, at least for the foreseeable future. I think maybe as a way of backing out, I think it may be useful to emphasize more strongly in both papers what motivates U.S.-Korean collaboration beyond seeking an alternative to China. I have a sense that, for example, I know that Korean companies are good at making cars and batteries. Is the presumption that Korean firms might also be good further up the supply chain in terms of processing of minerals? I know that there's, for example, and this isn't discussed in the paper, but perhaps it could be. I know there's an interest in having Korean companies take up an ownership stake in Indonesian nickel processing facilities, which are currently owned by China. And if Indonesia were to conclude a free trade agreement with the U.S., this would potentially make Indonesian nickel eligible for Inflation Reduction Act tax credits without falling foul of this foreign entities of concern rules. Now, whether or not that's desirable with the battery chemistry kind of moving away from nickel, it's not quite clear to me. But this sort of gets into the nitty gritty of like, is there something there for U.S. Korean collaboration, and a little bit more specificity about cases like that, I think would be helpful. And in the biotechnology paper, I wondered if there's a parallel area where South Korean firms are especially good and where partnership with American companies makes sense. It sounded like, upstream active pharmaceutical ingredients is one that at the end of the day, neither country knows that much how to do that stuff, and it's mostly ultimately reliant on China and India. And so it sounds like they're both investing in that area, but I wondered if there are common health problems of high priority where partnerships to address cancers, Alzheimer's, or next generation flu vaccines, where it's seen that the partnerships might have the biggest benefit. I think the paper's a bit silent on what problem collaborative efforts are trying to solve other than the reliance on China. I had a little bit of, I'm going to run short of time. I think some of the prose in the papers might require readers to already be steeped in the policy areas. So, in the biotech paper, I kind of wanted to what is biotechnology 101? It wasn't clear to me until about halfway through that agriculture was actually part of it. And the paper might benefit from a little bit of a kind of summary judgment of the degree of success of collaboration like the energy climate paper does, that you could basically say in the health space, it looks like things are relatively robust, but in the ag space, because of Korean biotechnology rules, that it may be challenging for there to be, say, U.S. private sector exports over there. And I struggled in the climate energy paper to make as much sense of the hydrogen section as I wanted. The three pillars of so much of it seems to be bound up with what are the U.S. rules for the hydrogen sector, which are in flux. But there's some decent explainers out there. I just would kind of go over that because for lay readers who aren't familiar with that sector, it may be challenging. And there are a couple of other places where you talk about like the inertial power offered by nuclear. That could be helpful. Let's see. I also wanted to know a little bit more about domestic politics in Korea. I think the biotech paper is strong on this one, but I wondered if there's likely to be, we're all aware of the volatility in the U.S. Political environment with the pending elections, but there was a big shift in nuclear policy in Korea with the change in administration. Is that likely to endure, or is that something that could, do we expect this to potentially change again? Let's see. I thought the paper, going back to the energy climate paper, I thought this paper could also have reflected a little bit more on foreign direct investment in the U.S. by Korean companies, such as Hyundai, which is building a new EV factory in Georgia. There are also Korean investments in the battery space. I think you give a sort of top-line perspective on what those numbers are, but a little bit more granularity on what the private sector interests are in this space. One other point is you covered so much ground by doing batteries, hydrogen, and nuclear. I almost felt like, and maybe this kind of cuts against the way you have the sort of like good cooperation in the battery space, more mixed in the two other areas, and in the same way that you cover both health and agriculture. At some level, I maybe just wanted a batteries paper, and that kind of cuts against the comment I said. But there's maybe more to say, like the Indonesia example where Korea could play a role. I guess I'd close by saying, there could be a little bit more of a, theoretical chapeau to open these papers of, what do they need? What does each country need? What are they good at? What are their constraints, and what does the ultimate intersection of these constraints mean for the prospects for cooperation, and sort of, what these papers are trying to do to analyze that. That sort of opening chapeau could be helpful to sort of scene set more along the lines of both of your oral comments today, because the papers sort of jump in and there's a lot of stuff that's happening in terms of diplomatic engagement and a lot of facts, but to sort of anchor that into like, what are the prospects for collaboration in this sector could be useful. I felt like the themes that came up in the last panel about abandonment and entrapment, that gets at those sort of pain points that Adam alluded to earlier, that could be something that maybe we want to come back to as a sort of summary judgment to think about, like, will this work, or is this going to be a consistent source of tension as we move away from solely a security alliance, but an economic security alliance where private sector interests and the sort of national security imperative are not going to be fully aligned, and they're going to be more and different sources of tension in the future. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. That's a lot of questions, a lot of food for thought. I'm happy that actually some of the constructive feedback tracked with some of the editorial notes that we've provided for the paper. So it's nice to have that consistency. Ilan, I want to give you first chance to respond.
Great. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Dr. Busby. Feedback very, very well taken, and I certainly agree. A whole paper just on batteries probably still would need to be longer than my current paper covering all three in order to really get into the granularity level that is necessary.
Partially my fault because I tasked him with some of this, so I should take some blame.
I had to pick 2 to 3 areas of technology, so exactly, yeah. But I think when we think about the question of decoupling, friendshoring, resilience, and supply chain risks, the differentiation between different critical minerals and processed products and sort of later stage final assembly products is really important. I think criticality, as you mentioned, is a dynamic term when we're talking about minerals. Cobalt, nickel, and manganese used to be crucially important in China, was the whole game in town. Now there are lithium iron phosphate batteries, potentially other chemistries that do away with lithium completely, like sodium batteries, other arrangements like solid state. There's a recent piece in Foreign Policy arguing that a lot of our investments in lithium ion batteries that aren't solid state are going to end up becoming obsolete, and that we should focus on leapfrogging. In terms of what both countries actually can do in order to reduce reliance on China, I do think that part of the risk with Chinese dominance in these supply chains is related to national security. A lot of critical minerals are used also for security applications, but it's really challenging to compete with the scale of Chinese mineral processors without the know-how of those processors. So I think the politics of Chinese joint ventures in the U.S. is really misguided. The opposition to Ford's joint venture with CATL, a Chinese battery firm, I think really misses some of the learning by doing innovation lessons that we can acquire ready-made. We're, I think, in the U.S. more used to sharing our advanced technology with others. I think it involves a little bit of difficult humility and change of reference to say, hey, we actually need to learn a bit from China on the mineral refining and later stage EV construction costs. I don't think that U.S. consumers are indefinitely going to be willing to pay $30,000 for a U.S.-made EV if you can buy a $10,000 Chinese EV that's just as good, if not better. At the same time, I don't think that the U.S. electorate is going to support a robust transition that doesn't include domestic industries growing and providing economic opportunities. So there's some real tensions there. I think outside of straight subsidies for the processing, one of the bigger actions that the U.S. and South Korea could take would be to encourage more establishment of exchanges and indices for prices that allows producers and downstream users of these materials to hedge and to have clear expectations about where the market is going and what supplies are going to be available. Strategic stockpiles of critical minerals is also another popular solution suggestion. The IEA, the US, and lots of other groups are trying to think about how this might work, but The Strategic Petroleum Reserve of the U.S. is a great institution, but oil basically comes with two types of characteristics. You can have light or heavy oil, you can have sour or sweet oil, and then you can refine all of those types of oil into all of the various organic chemistry products that we need under our current economy. The same is not true even for different ores that produce the same minerals like lithium. You have spodumene, which is an ore, you have lithium brines, which are a totally different process. And then there are the questions of, are we going to physically take delivery? Are we going to be concerned with price fluctuations in addition to security and resilience? And these are all really open questions that are harder to answer. And I think most of the other comments were very, very appreciated editorial and like higher level lit review notes that I would love to incorporate within the constraints of the space. But very, very insightful comments and a difficult set of challenges to solve, no doubt.
I really liked how you pointed out that there is a need, and I think the biotech paper to highlight the areas of common priorities for cooperation. I think what's kind of unique about biotechnology is that the potential and the opportunities for biotechnology innovation are a bit more visceral. I think everybody wants a solution, a cure to cancer. I think everybody wants safer, healthier lives. I think everybody wants food security. That opportunity and that optimism, I think, makes the risk of Chinese economic coercion even scarier. And I think even more of a national security risk of, if you cannot obtain critical medicines and, crops, that is a concern that I think would strike a chord with a lot of different people. Those areas of common health priorities and kind of common priorities in biotechnology, I think that common goods argument could definitely make for, I think, stronger, deepened cooperation between the US and South Korea. I think both innovation ecosystems and biotechnology have strong IP protections, strong drivers of investments and R&D. I think we're seeing, again, like I highlighted it briefly in the paper, but I think I would like to expand on it more, is there is an increase in government investment in this area. And so with that government investment, what are the priorities we want to set between the two countries? And I think there is a lot of opportunity there to set priorities that not only lead to, I think, common goods and common benefits, but also lead to a profitable and innovative industry sector. I do appreciate also what you mentioned about, kind of anchoring the beginning of the paper in what is useful for cooperation. Like I mentioned before, I think that IP protection is something that is, again, something that the US and South Korea share. And frankly, we're seeing that, China does not have that same level of respect. We're seeing with the civil military fusion, the transfer of IP and technology to the PLA, to the Chinese military, makes that cooperation more difficult for both countries. And so there is that common ground between the US and South Korea to then, increase cooperation bilaterally with that in mind. So that's just what I wanted to highlight.
Dr. Busby, do you have any response to their responses?
Yeah, I was going to go back to, there was a note I had in the margin about the section on transparency in markets, and that was a section where I really thought that you needed to elaborate a little bit more in the climate paper in particular. That's where what was meant by that. There's a sort of shorthand for it that. What would that look like? And so just a little bit of expansion on that. That just occurred to me as a follow-on. But I'm happy to open it up and have other questions from.
Are there any questions? We're gathering them online. I see some in the back. Oh, you've got microphone is coming.
I had a question about your hydrogen in Korea. First, my understanding is Korea plans to be an importer of hydrogen and a user. Where are they looking at getting it? Is it China, Australia, United States? And then number two, United States doesn't seem to be a big user in terms of energy, but certainly in fertilizer. How can Korea and the United States work to develop cleaner hydrogen, just period, whether you want to use it for fertilizer or energy?
So I don't know exactly where Korea plans to source it yet. I know that there are plans to import from the U.S. and Australia, but it's an open question how much they'll be able to generate domestically and in different uses. I guess the question of what the U.S. and Korea can do to encourage better uptake is, I think, more of a political question. In Korea, the current administration has implemented clean hydrogen procurement standards that are requiring existing users of gray hydrogen to use increasing shares of clean hydrogen. They're setting up an exchange, a centralized market exchange, so that bids can be transparent and visible to everyone. I think that's an example of a good way to do clean hydrogen procurement policy. I think in the U.S., we're really in the what are we doing here stage in the hydrogen debate, and the question is much more about like how much investment in hydrogen are we actually going to see out of the Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act subsidies for hydrogen, and also like what demand pull incentive policies are going to be viable for that. So does that look like a tax on especially carbon intensive hydrogen use? Does that look like a contract for difference approach where the government will pay the cost difference for the consumer of hydrogen, and whether they're actually going to be sort of the fiscal and political resources necessary to invest in solutions like that over the coming years, especially with higher interest rates and the tax cliff from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 coming up in 2025. At least in DC, folks are not in the same mode of sort of handing out money for various technologies now. It's much more about like what's worth it, what's on the chopping block, and what's going to happen depending on the elections. I'm not in the camp that thinks the IRA is going to disappear if Republicans win, but I do think that who is in charge of administering those programs at DOE and energy really matters a lot as well. And so I don't really know what prospects there will be for clean hydrogen procurement policy in the U.S., and that's actually one of the big gaps in U.S. hydrogen policy that I see.
Just one of the things that occurred to me in that conversation, which comes back to something else that was in the paper about IP sharing and the nuclear contestation between the U.S. and Korea over the sale to Europe, suggested that if they had a cleaner agreement, because it sounded like Korean nuclear providers, and this may be apropos of slightly different discussion, but may be relevant in that if they had some sort of agreement on exporting shared IP that was developed together of some profit sharing, then the U.S. firms wouldn't have been so put out that they didn't get the contract. And that may be relevant for standards if there's going to be collaboration across a range of sectors, whether it's hydrogen, nuclear in the future, or biotechnology, that there are sort of rules of the road that if you've developed some IP together, that there ought to be some compensation mechanisms if one of them goes for a contract with a third country for export. And that's something that, I think some of these bilateral gatherings could really help make some progress on.
In the back there.
On technologies, whether currently available or potentially available, where do you stand on the various targets that are being set for years like 2035 and 2050 by governments as well as private corporations, since most of the individuals that are setting these targets will either be dead or not in a position of authority when those years roll around?
I think the question of climate targets is also a somewhat politically fraught one. I think the science of climate is clear enough that we need to move as fast as we practically can, and the question is much more about what political frames and actual policies and implementation of those policies will get us there fastest. If the majority of a democracy thinks that a net zero 2050 target or cutting emissions by 50% by 2035, 50 to 52% by 2035 in our case, is feasible and helps marshal those resources, then I think it can be helpful. But I also think that a little bit too much oxygen gets spent on what targets should be rather than like what we can do to hit actual emissions reductions, get steel in the ground for real projects. So I don't have, I guess, like a definitive answer on that, but whether we get to net zero in 2050 or 2070 has huge economic security and just life and death implications for people around the world. So my preference is as fast as we can actually do as much decarbonization as possible, we should.
I think the biotechnology sector doesn't have, those same timelines and deadlines that maybe you see in green energy and climate-related discussions. But something that is worth noting is that, like I mentioned before, biomanufacturing has a wide range of applications and has the potential to create alternative production processes. So what that means is that, it provides the opportunity to create plastics, oils, and other alternatives to petroleum-based manufacturing. And the fact that this is on our doorstep, this entirely new form of manufacturing, means that we could potentially unlock a new industrial revolution, a bioindustrial revolution. And I think that still hasn't reached the public discourse yet of what that entails and what that means, and what are the deadlines and kind of timelines we want to implement that. I think there is a commonality in this interest, whether it's from the national security perspective, whether it's from the climate perspective, or the economic security perspective, that you want to place your own country, the U.S., in my case the U.S., at the forefront of this revolution. So I would definitely say that the biotechnology industry doesn't have those deadlines and timelines, but there is a growing sense of urgency and awareness of kind of what is the potential of this technology.
A question on the role of competition with China, and particularly security competition with China on the biotech front. So the paper talks about that the idea that amid rising tensions with China, there's a convergence of mutual aims between the U.S. and the ROK, and I think broadly speaking that's accurate. I guess I wanted to know, and I'm thinking a bit about the first panel discussion and the kind of identifying the challenges still to be worked through. A little bit more about how to think about, or what the challenges are in thinking about biotechnology as an area where there are real national security, technological competitiveness, and economic innovation issues at stake. But there are also some real global public goods where potentially excluding all of the sort of human academic research talent in China might not be the fastest way to get to, for example, a cure for cancer, right? So I don't know how to think about a situation. Are we saying that we would want to have keep that competitiveness if the cost is that China, a sort of potential cure for cancer that could be found within China doesn't happen because it's in China, right? So how do you square the sort of potential for biotechnology to provide global public health goods with the very real parallel risks of the way that those technologies are being securitized by the party state and the current policies that the party state's pursuing? It just strikes me that, especially for the alliance, there might be there's a range of opinions in the United States. My understanding is that from talking to South Korean colleagues and friends is that there's some range of opinion about how to think about that writ large in South Korea's own China policy. And so how do we think about that in the bilateral relationship as well, given that sort of those two potentially cross-cutting ways of thinking about biotech?
I think it's kind of difficult to unpack all the different parts of that question. I think I'll try to provide, I think, a broad strokes kind of bigger picture or bigger framework here that we could operate under. I think biotechnology, like any other emerging technology sector, is very much informed by the values, the cultural, societal context of the technology development, and oftentimes technology development reflects that context. With that in mind, I think when we look at the public good kind of argument for whether that be more open collaborations or more broader collaborations, with including China, I think it's important to remember that the concerns for those collaborations is that the value systems are inherently different. And so when we talk about biotechnology, most folks, I think, want to see this technology sector to be used for the public good, to enable healthier, longer lives. But when DNA is being used to track and trace minorities, that is a difference in value system. And so I think we have to be very deliberate. We are on the doorstep of, rapidly advancing critical and emerging technologies that may at times run past, the intentions and the values we want to implement in these technologies. And so I think that's where I see that cause for concern, causing that divergence and that kind of, I don't want to say decoupling, but that de-risking and kind of the separation, I think, between the US and China innovation ecosystems. I also think that, from what I understand, South Korea shares many of our concerns. We want to see these democratic, rules-based kind of values being reflected in technology development and in particular in the biotechnology sector. And again, like I mentioned before, there are common shared values for respecting IP and tech transfer and ensuring that, researchers who develop, say, a vaccine that could end up saving hundreds, if not thousands or millions of lives, it reaches the people it's intended to reach. So I think, I guess in broad strokes, that's how I would characterize kind of the question and the issues that you've presented, that difference in value system and why we're seeing the divergence that we're seeing today. And I don't think it's necessarily intended to be protectionist or to beat down a certain rising country, but I think it is a reflection of the difference in value systems.
If I could offer a related thematic response on what an additional value of reducing our reliance on China, especially in the battery space, but I think in energy more broadly, is that China's production is particularly carbon intensive across sectors. That's also true for some of South Korea's heavy industry sectors, certainly, but I think the US would trust South Korean carbon intensity accounting much more than they would trust Chinese carbon intensity accounting. And when you add up all of the embodied carbon of, say, a US EV battery versus a Chinese EV battery, the difference in carbon intensity is around 3 times as carbon intensive for the Chinese battery. So there are also just real practical reasons why there are benefits to some of this diversification. As a healthcare consumer, I'm a cancer survivor. I would definitely take a Chinese cancer cure if I could trust that it worked. But our scientific systems don't seem that interlinked, and so that illegibility makes it that much harder to align on questions that are really thorny, like how would you account for the carbon intensity of the grid electricity used to make hydrogen in China versus in South Korea or the US.
We have time for just one more question, if there is one. Okay, I'll take your deafening silence as that there isn't one. Well, I want to thank both speakers for the second panel, but all our speakers, and of course, Dr. Busby and Director Klein's contributions as discussants. When you're a moderator, you can never fully focus on what's going on. But there was so much interesting said, so I'm really looking forward to rewatching this, which everyone would be able to do. We will post this on our website. And just 2 closing thoughts. As I mentioned, the papers will be finalized in the coming weeks and will be published in our journal Korea Policy. And they'll also be published with 1 to 2 page policy briefs as well for those less intrepid researchers who need things quicker. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so UT students will have access to those as well through the Clements-Strauss distribution. Also, we will have a second tranche of papers also focused on U.S.-Korea cooperation in the areas of space, cyber, and Defense Industrial Cooperation, which we'll have at KEI's office on Wednesday, November 13th, at which point we should have a conclusion to our pending election. So there'll be maybe more food for thought in that regard. But that will also be broadcast on KEI's YouTube channel. So please tune in for that. And then just finally, thank you very much, Sheena, and the whole Clements-Strauss Center, and Mara as well. So much gets done behind the scenes, and you spearhead that. So very much appreciate your assistance, and of course my colleagues, Mayana Presley and Sam over there, who assist me greatly with what I do. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to future collaboration.